Hello my friends, it's the Game Boy Geek here. Today, we find ourselves as the captain aboard the Interplanetary Cosmic Express cruise line when it's discovered that the president of that Cosmic Express line has been murdered. We must examine the evidence, interrogate the prime suspects, and figure out who the murderer is. Murder on the Cosmic Express is for 3 to 6 players for ages 8 and up and only takes about 5 minutes to play and is published by Screech Dragon Studios. Today, we'll be doing a rule school where I'll teach you how to set up and play so that you don't have to read the rulebook yourself. Now, I've placed timestamps below me in the description of this video just in case you want to jump to a specific section of the rules. Without further ado, let's get started. Murder on the Cosmic Express is a social deduction game for 3 to 6 players that plays in only 5 minutes, where each player has a role with a very special and unique victory condition. Now each of the roles are secret, nobody knows who anybody else is. Each game there's a murderer weapon, and the murderer is secretly trying to get both of those and not get arrested. The accomplice is trying to make sure the murderer doesn't get arrested by possibly drawing suspicion to themselves, but making sure they don't end up with any of the murder weapons. The captain and the undercover detective don't know each other, but they're trying to work together to find and arrest the murderer, making sure that they don't have any of the murder weapons. During a 1-minute timed round, players are going to be trading weapons with each other, trying to gain information and trying to get their victory condition met. And there's 2 more roles and more weapons for higher player counts, and even though the game only takes 5 minutes, you can play a longer game variant as well. To set up, you're going to split the cards up into 2 different decks, a characters and roles deck and a weapons deck. I'm going to show you how to construct these 2 decks for 4 or more players. If you're playing with 3 players, at the end of this video, I'm going to show you how to set up the 3-player variant and play with those additional rules. But again, if you're playing with 3 players, still watch the whole video. If you're playing with 4 players, from the characters and roles deck, you're going to use the captain, the accomplice, the murderer, and the undercover detective. And from the weapons deck, you're going to have 3 candlesticks, 3 fire extinguishers, and 3 wrenches. If you're playing with 5 players, add the decoy role and add 2 junk cards to the weapons. And if you're playing with 6 players, add the butler role and add the other 2 junk cards, so there's 4 of those. Then you're going to take those respective decks and shuffle them separately. Now here we're having a 4-player game set up. Each player is going to get 1 of the role cards and 2 weapon cards face down. Only the players that gets these cards can look at them, but you're never allowed to show what you have. There will be 1 weapon card left. This will go face down in the middle of the table. No one can look at this yet. Now the game only takes 5 minutes to play and it's going to go through some different phases. The weapon here face down is the murder weapon, and this is important depending on the different roles because each role has a unique win condition, so let's talk about how you win the game. Now the captain and the undercover detective essentially are working together. They won't know who each other are, but they have the same victory condition, and that is having the murderer get arrested, which we'll show you how that works later, and they want to make sure that they don't have a murder weapon. Now the murderer does not want to be arrested, but they want to collect both of the murder weapons. Remember, there's 3 of the weapons. 1 of them will be the murder weapon face down in the middle of the table. This player wants to have the other 2 of that same weapon, but not get arrested. And the accomplice doesn't want this murderer arrested, but also doesn't want either of the murder weapons. Now, if you're playing with 5 or 6 players, if you're playing with a decoy, this player doesn't want to have a murder weapon, but they want to be the one that is accused of being the murderer, so they want to act suspicious. Where the butler wants the murderer arrested, and they want to collect junk. They need to have 2 junk cards, and they need the murderer to be arrested for the butler to win. So normally this murder weapon would be in the middle of the table, and these would be sort of separated out towards the people around the table, but to fit everything on camera, I've placed it nice and close like this. The game goes through 4 different phases: murder phase, investigation, interrogation, and arrest. Let's go through each of those phases now, starting with the murder phase. Now the beginning of that phase was actually putting out these cards just as we already have done, but then the most experienced gamer will go through this script. First, they'll ask everyone to close their eyes, including themselves. And they'll give everybody a minute to do that. And then with all the eyes closed, including theirs, they will feel for and then flip over the murder weapon. Now remember, everyone's eyes are closed right now. Then they'll say, the murderer may open their eyes and look at the weapon. So everyone's eyes are closed except the murderer, and the murderer now knows that they're going to be trying to collect the other 2 fire extinguishers but not get caught. They'll give the murderer about 5 seconds to look at the card. Then they'll ask everyone to have their eyes closed, including the murderer, and then that dealer with their eyes closed will flip that murder weapon back over. Then they say, everyone open your eyes. Next, you'll go into the investigation phase, and to do this, you'll start a 1-minute timer. You can either use the sand timer in the game or any type of timer app. And when doing so, you want to put the timer on top of the murder weapon so to make sure that nobody looks at it by accident. Now I'm going to remove this timer for the rest of this video, but know that that's where you put the timer. Now during this 1 minute, players are going to be exchanging weapons cards with other players. You never touch your roll cards, they're always face down in front of you. Now the weapons cards are actually going to be in players' hands. They're going to be holding them in front of themselves. This would be the murder weapon in the middle of the table. Now to exchange cards, you'll take one of your cards, your weapons, and place it in front of the person that you want to swap with and keep your hand on it. Now the other player can, if they want to, take a card that they have and put it like this. If you both agree, then you swap and you do it just like that. There are no turns and things are happening in real time, and you can trade with any player you'd like. And keep in mind, even if you're offering a trade, at any point in time you can pull it back. Now once the 1 minute timer for the investigation phase ends, you'll go to the interrogation phase. At this point, whoever has the captain's roll card is going to flip it over. And at this point, players are going to share any information that they feel is relevant, but you're not allowed to reveal any cards, roll cards, or items. Players will be discussing which weapons they saw, which ones they think are the murder weapons, or trying to figure out who is who and where are the murder weapons. Once the captain feels like they've gotten enough information, they'll move to the arrest phase and people need to stop talking. At this point, the murder weapon is revealed. Now, this might change the captain's thinking of who might be the murderer. But at this point, the captain is going to arrest one of the players. And they do that simply by pointing at them and saying, I'm arresting you. And then each player will flip over their roll cards and weapons so everybody can see all of the cards. So here we can see the fire extinguisher is the murder weapon. This player, who's the murderer, actually had both of the murder weapons. Now, if the captain had pointed to this player, that's who they wanted to arrest, well, the captain and the undercover detective would have won because they arrested the murderer and they don't want a murder weapon. Neither of them had the murder weapon and they arrested the murderer. However, if the captain pointed at either of these 2 players, then the murderer and the accomplice would have won. And this is because the murderer had both of the weapons and didn't get arrested, and the accomplice wins because they didn't want the murderer to be arrested and they don't want either of the murder weapons. Now in a 4-player game, if it looked like this and the captain arrested this player, nobody would win because these 2 wouldn't win because they did not arrest the murderer. The murderer wouldn't win because they didn't have both of the murder weapons, and the accomplice wouldn't win because they don't want a murder weapon even though the murderer didn't get caught. Now when played with 5 or 6 players, the decoy wins if they're arrested but don't have a murder weapon. Let's say the murder weapon was still the fire extinguisher. They don't have it, but if they looked suspicious enough to be arrested, the decoy would win. The decoy also wins if nobody else wins, which means late in the game they might have a murder weapon, which was the fire extinguisher, and at the very last moment they might trade this with someone who's not the murderer and trying to get them arrested, which means the decoy would win because nobody else won. And speaking of 5 or more players, with that player count as shown in setup, you'll be adding junk as one of the possible murder weapons, and if junk is the murder weapon, the murderer only needs to collect one of those junk. Now when playing with 6 players, the butler wins by having the murderer arrested but collecting 2 junks. Now this will make them look suspicious because once they get 2 junks, they're not going to want to trade, and it will make them look like a murderer because what a murderer tries to do, let's say the fire extinguisher is the murder weapon, they'll try to get these and stop collecting and changing cards because they have both murder weapons. So the butler might look guilty and look like the murderer, so they gotta get these 2 junk cards but still get the murderer arrested. Now for general tips, when you're trying to hunt for the murderer, look for someone who stops trading cards because they might have the murder weapons. Obviously keep in mind, during the game these cards are face down, but I'm just showing you these now. Also, if someone refuses to trade a specific card, that might indicate that they might be the murderer. If you think you have the murder weapon figured out, when you pass it away to someone, try to keep an eye on what they're doing with it. Now if you are the murderer, you'll be tempted to stop trading early, but it makes you very suspicious. So you need to maybe possibly trade murder weapons away, but then try to get them back in a subsequent trade. And during the interrogation phase, consider naming the real murder weapon and accusing someone else of having it, or consider naming the wrong murder weapon to cause a lot of chaos. If you're the undercover detective, remember you're trying to assist the captain in finding out who the murderer is, so you're going to want to keep trading until the end of the game and try to share with them what you've learned. Now, as the accomplice, you're trying to ensure that the murderer does not get arrested. So if you can figure out the murder weapon, it's ideal to stop trading early to throw suspicion on yourself because people think that you're the murderer. However, you know that the murderer needs both murder weapons, so you'll need to get that to them before the end of the round. But remember, you'll still win as long as anyone other than the murderer gets arrested, including yourself, as long as you don't have a murder weapon. Now you can play a longer game variant. To do this, you play one round per the number of players. So if you're playing with 4 players, you'll play the game 4 times, keeping track of who wins each round, also keeping track if they won as the captain or the murderer. Because at the end of the game, of those rounds, in this case 4, whoever has the most points, 1 point for every time they've won, has won the game. But if they're tied, then the player who won the most as the captain would win, and if it's still tied, the one who won the most as the murderer would win. To play the 3-player variant, you're going to use the 4 cards that are normally used in a 4-player game: the captain, the murderer, the undercover detective, and the accomplice. However, you're going to take the captain and the murderer out just for now. You're going to take the undercover detective and the accomplice, you're going to shuffle these 2 roll cards up. And you're going to deal these out, one of them, to a dummy player. You'll then add the captain and the murderer back in, you'll shuffle these cards up, and deal them out as normal. So even though there's 3 human players, there'll be 1 dummy player set up, so it will look like a 4-player game. And also noting that there'll be 1 murder weapon in each of the players, including the dummy player will have 2 weapons. Now during the investigation phase, you play as the normal rules, but any player can exchange 1 item card at a time from your hand with one of the face-down dummy player's cards. And when you get to the arrest phase, it plays the same as I've already shown. Well, I hope this helped you dive right into Murder on the Cosmic Express and get to the fun quicker than you normally would if you had to read the rulebook yourself. Now, if you have further questions about the rules, I've placed a link below me right in the description of this video. Now, that's the best place to ask them, since not only will I be notified, but so will Screech Dragon Studios.